Good afternoon. My name is Michelle Ashton. I'm the Director of Communications for the Fish and Wildlife Foundation of Florida. And on behalf of our entire board and staff, I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to talk about manatees with us. A couple of quick housekeeping items before we get going. Please ensure that you are muted and you remain muted throughout the duration of our conversation today. The exception would be is if you want to ask your question directly to our presenters during the Q&A portion at the end. If so, you can use the raise your hand feature. I'll ask you to unmute and you can talk directly with our presenters. The other way to ask a question is to drop it in the chat and I can ask it for you. That feature is particularly helpful if you have a question pop up at the end and you want to make sure you don't forget it. So I'm really excited to introduce our speakers today. We're joined by the Foundation's President and CEO, Andrew Walker, and Michelle Pasowitz and Ron Mezek, who are with FWC's Imperiled Species section. Andy, I'm going to send it over to you. Andy, I think you're muted.
I am, I'm sorry. Michelle, thank you very much. And everyone, thank you also for joining us today, and particularly to Ron and Michelle for the information and briefing they're going to provide to us all. As you all know, manatees have been making international headlines in the last year because of the problems in Indian River Lagoon. And the public outpouring of support has really been encouraging to us all. The good news here, and I'm sure Ron and Michelle will say more about this, but is that, you know, over the last 30 years, manatees have really come back from the low levels they were at. And there are now more than 9,000 manatees in the state. But we do have significant problems in Indian River Lagoon that have required mobilization. And that's largely what we'll be talking about today. So, and we can talk also today about other ways that you can try to support conservation of manatees and other marine mammals. But I'd like to go ahead and pass it to Michelle, who is the biological administrator with the Imperiled Species Management program at FWC. Ron is the section leader for that program, and they are the point people within the agency who know most about manatees in the current situation. So Michelle, if I may, I'd like to pass it to you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're really honored to be here, happy to present on manatees, give you a little bit of background, of course, on what the biology of a manatee is, make sure we're all on the same page. Happy to tell you about what our agency does and the responsibilities that the FWC has for the management of the Florida manatee. And then we're going to round out today's discussion with some recaps and background on the unusual mortality event that the manatees are currently facing within the Indian River Lagoon, such as Andy's mentioned. So I'm going to go ahead and request remote control from you, Michelle, if you don't mind. All right, but thank you, Michelle and Andy, for that introduction. And once we get squared away here, I'll go ahead and get started for you. All right. It looks like we're all set. So for bandwidth purposes, I'm going to go ahead and turn off my video and let's get rolling. All right, thanks again, everyone. Again, my name is Michelle Pasowitz. I am the program coordinator or biological administrator for the Manatee Management Program out of Tallahassee, Florida. And the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, or the FWC for short, we're the state agency responsible for the management of the Florida manatee. It's an iconic species and it's so important to our agency and to the public, so we're fully dedicated to all things manatees, from rescue to research and the overall management of the population, which of course includes implementing the critical protection measures that we have in place today. But before we dive into some of the great work that our agency does, let's talk a little bit about the biology of the manatee. Manatees are slow-moving marine mammals. They inhabit both freshwater and marine ecosystems throughout the state of Florida and beyond. They do prefer shallow habitats, which does allow for great viewing opportunities for the average visitor to Florida. So most viewing opportunities can be seen right from land, which is great. And because manatees breathe air, the easiest way to spot them is for when you're watching the surface of the water, they're going to come up and you're going to see that snout come up as you see in the video. They're going to take a big gulp of air at the surface of the water, and that's likely going to be the easiest way for someone to spot them if you're unfamiliar with looking for them. Manatees are found in both clear freshwater systems as well as brackish and murky water, so the back of the manatee or the nose is certainly the best way to see them. Their large lungs do allow them to breathe to hold their breath for 20 minutes or so when they're in a resting state. And when they're more active, they can breathe at a rate of every 3 to 5 minutes or so. And the average adult manatee will weigh about 1,000 pounds. As you can see in the map in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, this is the range of the Florida manatee as we know it today. Manatees, being a subspecies of the West Indian manatee, is found primarily in southeastern United States, with summer or seasonal ranges expanding along the Atlantic coast of the United States through Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia, as well as west of Florida through Louisiana, and sightings even as far west as Texas. But during the winter season, manatees will make their way back to Florida, particularly peninsular Florida, so that they can find some warm water for the winter time. Like most Floridians, manatees do like to stay warm in the winter. And while we often think of manatees as round and fat, they actually have less true blubber than most marine mammals. And because they eat a low energy diet of plants, their metabolism is not high enough for them to generate body heat on their own to keep themselves warm, especially when the water temperatures drop. So the cold water temperatures around their body certainly does impact their metabolism and their internal body temperatures. And when we hit that threshold of 68 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 degrees Celsius in the water in Florida, manatees will start seeking out their winter warm water sites all around the state, and they'll find these dependable sources, and most of them will stay at these locations throughout the winter season. Unfortunately, it's critical to know that there could be both short-term and long-term impacts to these habitat types. There are two functional types of warm water habitats that are used by Florida manatees to survive the cold winter seasons. The first is a warm water discharge, which is a continuous flow of water at temperatures above ambient temperature. Typically, these consist of natural springs and outfalls from industrial facilities such as power plants. And these are used by approximately 2/3 of all manatees throughout the state. And out of these primary and secondary sites, there are 11 power plants and 27 spring and spring complexes, as you can see on the map here. The second functional type of warm water is a passive warm water habitat, and these are also known as thermal basins. And they're typically created by thermoclines, haloclines, or other physical conditions that temporarily slow the cooling process. And out of the 4 Florida manatee management units, which Ron will touch on a little bit later, the Northwest, Southwest, St. Johns River, and Atlantic, there's a total of 73 primary and secondary warm water sites. The other really important habitat to consider for manatees is forage. They're opportunistic and generalist herbivores, and this is also where they get their name, the sea cow. But they spend up to 8 hours a day grazing on submerged aquatic vegetation, and a healthy manatee in the wild is going to consume about 4 to 9% of their body weight per day. Submerged aquatic vegetation, or SAV for short, includes both seagrasses found in marine ecosystems, as well as freshwater aquatic vegetation, both of which grow throughout Florida's water bodies. SAV does play a critical role in the marine ecosystem as well as Florida's economy. It helps to stabilize sediment, it maintains good water quality, and provides food and habitat for all sorts of marine organisms, especially manatees. But some of the freshwater aquatic plant species that manatees will forage on include eelgrass, coontail, and even exotic species such as water hyacinth or hydrilla. Of the seagrasses found in Florida, manatees enjoy shoalgrass, turtlegrass, and many other types as well. Oops. Unfortunately, there are quite a few threats to SAV, both direct and indirect. Some of the direct ones that we think about would be dredging of waterways. We have to deepen Florida waterways to allow for easy navigability by large vessels. And this dredging does have a negative impact to the health of the SAV habitat below. We'll also see direct impacts to SAV when we're doing construction along the shoreline or building of boat facilities. That will result in shading from docks, as seagrass does need sunlight to grow. Additionally, we think about prop scars as seen here in this photo. That's a direct impact from propellers on boats as they go through shallow waterways. And lastly, more of the indirect impact to SAV or a long-term threat is that of excessive nutrient runoff from land. A lot of fertilizers and pesticides used in upland areas can be the cause of phytoplankton blooms, which does result in poor water quality and loss of seagrass, which we'll get into in a little bit later as well. But it is important to know that the conservation and protection of SAV and habitat alike is a partnership between stakeholders, industry, and government partners. And in addition to these entities, the general public can help to conserve the habitat by practicing smart boating, following marked channels and avoiding navigating through shallow seagrass beds, and avoid contributing to this runoff by being careful when applying fertilizers to your lawn if you live near the water. Talking a little bit about threats to the manatee, there are two that are considered natural. One of them is cold stress and the second is red tide. For cold stress, we know that animals exposed to cold water for prolonged periods of time can suffer from what we consider to be cold stress, or very similar to hypothermia in humans. Manatees might become emaciated, lethargic, or develop cold stress lesions all over their bodies, which is similar to frostbite. Fortunately, if a manatee is recovered in a cold area and we feel that they're suffering from cold stress, we can bring them into a rehab facility and offer them the care that they need. And if they're found early enough, they typically do recover and bounce back from this. The secondary natural threat is red tide or harmful algae blooms. We know that red tide is a naturally occurring algae bloom. It initiates offshore in the Gulf of Mexico and can make its way into nearshore waters. But the algae contains neurotoxins that's dangerous to manatees and other wildlife. They can inhale the neurotoxins when they surface to breathe, or they can ingest them when they eat seagrasses that are coated by the algae. Again, similar to cold stress, if we are able to rescue and recover any animals impacted from red tide, get them into a rehabilitation facility, they can recover and rebound fairly well from this event. Though, just like cold stress as well, some years are worse than others. We've seen cold stress and red tide years that were challenging for us to be able to rescue and recover all of the animals impacted. And we do have, unfortunately, a greater number of rescues associated with cold stress or red tide those years, as well as carcasses. Moving into some of the human-related threats, it is unfortunate to see that this list is slightly longer than the natural threats. But the probably most common one, or one that's most talked about in Florida, is that of watercraft collisions. Everyone that has seen a manatee in the water has likely seen a propeller scar on the back of a manatee, and it is because most adult animals have been struck by a vessel at least one point in their life. What we don't know, and what the public doesn't quite always understand, is that the propeller wounds that you see on a manatee is just one version of a watercraft collision injury. The other is that of blunt force trauma. If a vessel is moving at a greater speed and collides with a manatee, then that could cause significant internal damages to that animal, which could result in injury or death as well. And watercraft collisions that are a result of blunt force trauma and not necessarily propeller wounds do account for 75% of all mortalities associated with watercraft. So that's a significant number of animals who are actually impacted by the collision and the lower unit of the vessel. Additionally, another human-related threat and a long-term threat that is a concern to us is the loss of warm water habitat. We know that there is changes to our natural spring systems regarding access or flow. We also know that we're expecting to see some changes in industrial power plants. A lot of Power plants are expected to change their technologies over time, so we will likely see impacts to the source of warm water there. But we are working hard to adapt to these changes, and we'll get into that in just a little bit as well. Another human-related threat is that of coastal development. We don't think of this too much with manatees, but when you've got more folks moving to Florida and they want to live on the water, with that comes more water access. So more marinas, boat ramps, and essentially more vessels going directly into the water. And with coastal development, there is a lot of shoreline construction and stabilization that does impact the habitat directly as well. The fourth one on the list here is a little bit more obvious, and some folks think of this too, and that's entanglement or ingestion. So we try to avoid leaving any marine debris in the waterways and picking up after derelict fishing equipment as well, so the animals aren't directly impacted. And lastly is that of water control structures. We have quite a few water control structures throughout the state, and they can be harmful to manatees if they are locking through at an unfortunate time. But in order for our agency to offset these human-related threats to manatees, we work to develop protections and minimization measures to prevent take of the species. The Florida Manatee Sanctuary Act, which is outlined in Chapter 379 of the Florida Statutes, does allow our agency to implement certain regulations to protect from direct and indirect threats. So we'll discuss a few of these management actions in the next few slides, but it's important to know that this Sanctuary Act does require our staff to use the best available scientific information. So that being said, we work very closely with our internal and external researchers to collect the data that's needed to make our management decisions. And we use that data and the decisions that we're making to protect manatees from both direct and indirect threats, so directly to the animal or directly to their habitat. And while we're not going to talk too much about this today, a big component of what we do in manatee management is outside of the regulatory process, and is that of education and outreach, because that's so important for the public and for Florida citizens to understand why we make the decisions that we do, and also how they can help us. All right, the first management tool I'll talk a little bit about briefly is that of manatee protection zones and rules. I'm sure everyone who's been on the water in Florida has seen one of these signs. We do have them throughout the state. And as I mentioned, the Florida Manatee Sanctuary Act does give us the authority to regulate waterways for the protection of manatees. We review all of the available data and risk to manatees that we have, and we make determinations on where that risk is greatest, so we can slow boat speeds or limit access altogether. And all of these manatee protection zones and rules are put in place so that we could avoid harmful collisions by vessels or harassment by other humans entering a critically important area. We have about 14% of all of our manatee accessible waters in the state of Florida currently regulated, and we often have to review these and make sure that they are effective and appropriate at that time, because what we are also directed to do by the statute is balance the rights of manatee protections and the rights of waterway users. So we can't just place rules and regulations on every waterway where we see manatees. We have to be able to defend that by determining the level of risk and having the data there to help answer our questions. Additionally, we have the ability to exempt individuals through permit or variance from the rule from certain speed zones and certain access zones. Again, this helps us to balance the rights of waterway users and ensure that we're applying protective conditions to all of these permits if we're giving them the exemption to do so. Another management tool that we use very often in our office is the environmental commenting program. We use environmental commenting to help minimize threats from construction and development by providing environmental conditions to permitting agencies such as the Florida Department of Environmental Protection or the water management districts. We want to provide these conditions for in-water work such as dredging, blasting, or boat ramp and boat facility construction projects. And again, we're ensuring that our conditions will help avoid, minimize, and mitigate any impacts directly to manatees or their habitat. Another method that we use for management and protection is the use of our Manatee Protection Plans, or MPPs. There's currently 16 MPPs around the state, and they're each attached or assigned to a particular county. And these manatee protection plans help us to ensure the long-term protection of manatees within that county, as every area in the state is slightly different. And it also helps to provide developers a little bit of information on what we're seeking to find in our balancing. And they get a little bit of insight into what to expect for facilities and marina build-outs. And in order for the FWC to manage and protect Florida manatee habitat, we work with a variety of partners and others to monitor, restore warm water refugia and forage grounds. Some of the past projects that we've had and been successful at include increasing access to and quality of natural warm water springs through shoreline stabilization or dredging. We're also quite involved with seagrass restoration, oyster restoration to help with water quality. And we've had great success at a mitigation feature in Collier County at Port of the Isles, where we were able to create a brand new warm water site. But because of the future of warm water habitat in Florida being a little unknown or a little uncertain at this time, we're working closely with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to plan for the future. And the first step of that was the development of the Florida Manatee Warm Water Habitat Action Plan. This became available in November of 2019, and it does aid our agencies in planning for the long-term health and survival of warm water habitat throughout the state, both natural warm water sites and industrial. So it gives us a little bit of a planning document so that we can ask the right management and research questions and prepare to develop a conceptual plan for a long-term network of warm water habitat throughout the state, and most importantly, throughout each of our 4 management units. All right, well, I know, Andy, you brought this up, so here we go. I know the leaning J diagram is something that you might have seen in the past, especially others who have listened in on these foundation presentations. It's a success story, and we've seen it with the Florida black bear as well as the American alligator, and here's the version that we'll tell today for manatees. So this leaning J concept, or a paradigm shift, is what they're currently experiencing throughout the state of Florida. And the first part of this curve is that of little or no management. Early fossil records do indicate that manatees have inhabited Florida for millions of years, and centuries ago, the manatees were still found in abundant numbers. Unfortunately, though, as Florida began to be settled in early centuries, manatees were likely overexploited and hunted indiscriminately. Eventually, people did start noticing that manatees were becoming more and more rare, and that is when the first protections for manatees were enacted by the Florida legislature in 1893. So this first state law did make it illegal to hunt or kill manatees without a permit. But less than a century later, manatees received further protections from the Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972 and the Endangered Species Act of 1973. These federal laws protected manatees to the fullest extent possible, protected them from all harm and harassment. And not too much later, the state of Florida jumped on board and improved our protections as well in 1978 through the development of the Florida Manatee Sanctuary Act, which I've mentioned several times now. And so between these state and federal laws, manatees were fully protected, no harm or harassment by any means. And these state increase in protections did authorize our agency to implement all of the protections for manatees that we've talked about. So since the 1970s and 80s, and thanks to these protections that we were able to instill through the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Florida Manatee Sanctuary Act, we would say that the Florida manatee population has grown considerably. And in fact, it has rebounded. And for the last decade or so, we've been navigating the phase of what we refer to as recovery management. So the steady growth in population and the successful establishment of protection measures around the state, manatees certainly reached a point where they're considered to be stable. And in recent years, which we've talked or Andy's mentioned a little bit about earlier too, is our data and our population models do show that the manatee population is not only stable, but it has in fact increased. All of this good news did lead us to a huge milestone for the manatees in 2017, when the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service issued a final rule to reclassify the Florida manatee as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And this recommended status change was noted because of increases in the manatee population, as well as improvements to habitat. These improvements and increase in the population are a direct result of the protection measures that we've implemented and practiced throughout. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service ensured that this reclassification would not diminish any existing protections and would continue to play a vital role in the recovery of the species. Though as the number of manatees continues to rise and the human population in Florida also increases, we are finding ourselves in this last phase of the leaning J management paradigm, which is that of conflict management. In recent years, this conflict has increased dramatically, with more and more Florida residents moving and wanting to live in coastal areas or along the water. We've got more visitors and boats on the water, more people on manatee viewing eco tours that leads to more debris and fishing line in the water, and ultimately less and less habitat for manatees and less recreational space for humans. So with the two populations increasing side by side, there's bound to be inherent challenges and problems where all of our resources are limited. Again, we're sharing a lot of space with manatees, and we're seeing this combination of two growing populations side by side in a very small state when you think about it in the end. So we are doing the best that we can as our agency to find the right balance and continue to monitor the population of the Florida manatee and manage threats to the species, regardless of new and unprecedented challenges, such as the unusual mortality event, for example. And from there, I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to Ron, who will tell us a little bit more about the ongoing event.
Good afternoon. I'm going to take a second here to take control away from Michelle on the PowerPoint, I hope. Still working here. Michelle, I am not getting control.
I just went ahead and gave up the control, kicked it back to Michelle Ashton. Let's see if you can try again now, Ron.
All right, I've got it now. Thank you. All right, so my portion of the presentation this afternoon is to give an update on the Atlantic Coast Manatee Unusual Mortality Event, but I'm also going to follow up with FWC and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's joint planning and response that we're undertaking right now, and then follow up finally with some of the habitat restoration work that's being done. And so Michelle mentioned earlier that we have 4 management units in the state. And I want to use this slide to give you some context of what we're looking at. So we have these 4 management units, and they're based primarily on winter habitat for manatees. So during the summer, manatees on the East Coast range far and wide on the East Coast. We have manatees, as Michelle's map showed earlier, that go up into the Carolinas, and we've had reports as far north as Massachusetts. And on the West Coast, those manatees will range from Southwest Florida all the way across to Louisiana, and we actually had a rescue this year in Texas. So, and during the warm season, manatees range far and wide. There isn't a lot of exchange between the East Coast and West Coast. There's some, but not a lot. And when we get to winter, there's even less. And so animals that are using the Atlantic coast do during the winter months, sometimes a few of them will go into the St. Johns River, but not extensively. So these management units are based on these winter habitats where manatees stay relatively stable. And so we have 4 of those that we manage. For our purposes with the UME, we're talking about the Atlantic coast population that ranges from the lower St. Johns River down to Key West. But for the UME, most importantly, we're talking about the central area around the Indian River Lagoon, which runs about 150 miles along the coast. And we're talking with the UME primarily from Southern Mosquito Lagoon, which is Ponce Inlet down to Jupiter Inlet. But I will say that because some of these animals use this area a little bit differently, we have conducted rescues and recovered animals as far south as Broward County, and as far north as Jacksonville and southern Georgia that have experienced and are suffering effects from the UME. Those occur sometimes later in the year, but we do see that as well. So just to kind of show you what we saw starting last December, and I do want to note that when you look at these maps, the dots do represent carcasses that we have recovered, but they're not just associated with the UME. These are all causes of death along the Atlantic coast last winter. So that includes watercraft mortality, entanglements, all the things that Michelle mentioned earlier. And so early in December, we started to see an elevated number of carcasses, more than we expect that time of year. And that carried on into January, then February, and March. And by March, we had a pretty good idea of what was causing this. And we expected to see fewer manatee deaths as we got into the warmer weather and manatees could start to move far and wide again and experience different habitats that had more forage in it. And that is what we saw as we got into April and May. Those numbers of carcasses reduced significantly and actually got back to levels that would be expected during those times of year. So just kind of a recap and of the events as they happened and as we witnessed them. Early to mid-December, we started seeing that elevated mortality higher than what we see on an average. Along with that, we started to see some things in the manatees that we were rescuing or recovering, and that included abnormal buoyancy, field reports of animals that were thin. That correlated with reports from the Water Management District and their seagrass surveys that there was a substantial loss, further loss of seagrass vegetation in the Indian River Lagoon. Early on, we thought this mortality event might be related to cold stress, but as we looked at the data, moreover, we couldn't correlate cold weather that extended long enough to be the cause of these deaths. So as we gathered all this information over the course of the winter, our research staff formulated their hypothesis that there was an unusual mortality event. They collected the data and provided it to the National Marine Fisheries Service working group on unusual mortality events. And we do that to see if they will concur with our findings. And if they do, that group is responsible for moving it to the agency that would declare an unusual mortality event. And in this case, with manatees, that's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And National Marine Fisheries Service did concur with our findings, provided them to the service, and the Fish and Wildlife Service in March declared an unusual mortality event officially. As we got in the spring, we realized that, well, we were right that manatee deaths would decrease as they moved into better areas with better habitat. We also know that coming this winter, those animals would likely return to the Indian River Lagoon, and we would see an elevated mortality event again. And so we started our contingency planning efforts and response last summer, looking at other ways and other options of things that we could do to respond to this event. And so before I get to those, I just want to share with you what's happening, because what we're seeing with manatees is just a symptom of a larger issue. And while we can work on helping that symptom, that's not going to cure the cause. So the loss of Indian River Lagoon seagrass beds has been attributed to a water quality situation of nutrient loading over decades. And those nutrients have fueled long-term consistent algae blooms over the last 8 to 10 years. And as Michelle mentioned earlier, seagrass is a flowering plant that requires sunlight to grow. And these long-term phytoplankton blooms are so thick that they eliminate light reaching the bottom where seagrasses are found. And over time, that has led to the loss of these seagrass beds. Over 40,000 acres have been documented to be lost so far. And those remaining beds that we have, the density of seagrass shoots that are available are much less than they used to be before. Along with that, there is some alternative vegetation available to manatees in the lagoon at times, and that includes some of the macroalgae. But one thing we noticed last winter is those macroalgae weren't present either. And so those combination of factors are the cause of what not only manatees, but a lot of wildlife in the lagoon are experiencing right now. And you may ask the question, why manatees and why in Brevard County and why in the lagoon? And part of that, and a big reason for that is that their primary warm water site for many of the animals is at the Florida Power and Light Cape Canaveral Energy Center. This is not the only warm water site in the lagoon, and it is not the only one on the Atlantic coast. There are other ones, and some just as good and as big as this one, but this is one where we have at times had over 1,000 animals present during very cold periods in the winter. The animals that use this site, there's a lot of individual use patterns. We know that some of these animals know other warm water sites and will travel with the weather. When it's warm, they'll come up to Brevard County and take advantage of those habitats. When it gets cold, they'll move down to Riviera Beach, the power plant there, or as far down as Port Everglades, the power plant's down there. Other animals, as it warms up in spring, will move north and take advantage of Spartina Marsh all the way up through Georgia. And then there's a third set of manatees that we think their behavior is largely concentrated in Brevard County and the warm water sites there. And those animals may be the most susceptible to what's going on right now. Latest update, again, this is now over a year's worth of manatee recoveries, death and rescues. There are 814 manatee deaths that we've documented along the Atlantic coast. Again, this is all causes of death, not just the UME, and we have conducted 101 rescues as of January 7th. So this moves us into, our planning and response that we are continually working on and modifying. And so some of the things that went on this summer, first thing we did is we had a habitat workshop. This was to look at restoration efforts that we could contribute to the lagoon. And an impetus to that was that the legislature gave FWC $8 million to work for restoration projects related to manatees. But we were also working with the foundation on other restoration projects. And we have a restoration group in the agency that is annually working on restoration projects, some of those directly associated with manatees and some to different types of habitat. So it's not something new to us. We have been working on it for a while, but we have the opportunity now to do more. The other thing we did during the summer is we had an expert elicitation, and that was directed primarily at answering the question about supplemental feeding this winter. And at that elicitation, we invited experts on manatee health and marine mammal health, behavior, and then habitat. This was a chance for us to ask a number of questions to these experts and get their best information so we could make some difficult decisions. And associated with the supplemental feeding, it was, should we do this? Because there are pros and cons to doing this activity. And then if we should, can we get past the can we? There are a number of laws that we're all well aware of that feeding manatees is not something that is typically done and it is illegal. And then if all those two boxes are checked, then how do we do something if we do it? So that was the basis of the elicitation. what we're trying to accomplish if we do that is to reduce the number of rescues that we need to do and number of mortalities that are occurring. The reason for that is that we work closely with the Manatee Rehabilitation Partnership, the MRP. And this is a group of ocean area that are doing the helping with the rescues and doing the rehabilitation and release of these animals. And there is a limited number of bed spaces available at any given time. And with this UME, we are close to that maximum constantly. And so trying to reduce some of these rescues could help relieve that bottleneck. But along with that, we are looking at ways with that partnership to increase the number of bed spaces available. Another planning activity that took place was instituting the Joint Incident Command System. And this was done by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service jointly with us. And we have two commanders, one from our law enforcement and one from the Fish and Wildlife Service's Incident Command System. And what they provide us is a great benefit because they run a lot of our logistics. If we need something, they go out and find it, provide it. If we need people and we need trucks or we need something else, they go out and find it for us. And that allows us to concentrate on working on the manatee issues, the recovery, the rescues, and the supplemental feeding. So it's been a great help to us to this point. And they are also responsible for setting up our temporary field response station at the FPNL power plant. So other agency responses that are going on, we are constantly sharing and messaging what we're doing. We have a website, and you can see it here at the bottom, and we'll provide it again at the end of the presentation. But at that website, you can go find updates of everything we've been doing since last December and what we're doing now. We also held a media briefing this morning, so we are trying to share with what we are doing and what we're experiencing at this time. We continue to coordinate with the MRP. We are asking them for information and advice as we go forward. We are working with the Incident Command System to make our carcass recovery and disposal more efficient, our rescues more efficient. They have brought in staff and, like I mentioned earlier, trucks and people to remove those animals from the system, whether they are alive or dead. Part of that, again, is for the carcasses, we are trying to remove those animals so we are not adding more nutrients to that lagoon. That's not something that the lagoon needs. We are increasing our monitoring and tracking efforts. That helps us understand what manatees are doing currently, and that is a benefit to our efforts to know where to concentrate them. The UME investigation and monitoring activities also continue to help better understand how this happened, why it continues to happen, and how we can address it. And then we did check those boxes this winter that there were more pros than cons to supplemental feeding in the extent that it's a trial effort. And it's a trial because it's never been done before. We have no template to go by. So we've developed a system that we can scale up if it works, or scale down if we see that the cons are outweighing the pros at any time. And so that's the process we're in right now currently. And then the last thing I want to address is our habitat restoration and our activities there. So as I mentioned earlier, we were given $8 million as an agency to address restoring manatee access to springs and provide habitat restoration in manatee concentrated areas. That was the language provided to us by the legislature. And with that, we have focused on spring systems. As Michelle mentioned earlier, again, manatee warm water habitat is really important, and it is going to be changing in the future. And so this is an opportunity for us to start addressing some of those concerns. And then we're concentrating on our Atlantic coastal estuaries and habitat and submerged aquatic vegetation there. And then know that we are not doing this alone by any stretch of the imagination. We are working and collaborating with a wide number of partners that are both NGOs, local governments, and county governments that are being affected in these areas. And so some of the priority projects that FWC is working on right now include We've been working closely with the foundation on 7 vallisneria restoration projects. Those 7 projects are all in tributaries to the Indian River Lagoon. That makes them very important for several reasons. One, vallisneria, if you don't know, is a freshwater vegetation that is a food item for manatees. And these are all tributaries that manatees access and will look for forage and fresh water. And so that's a huge contribution. The other contribution that these projects give us are seagrasses are also a remover of nutrients from the system. So all water coming down through these tributaries will pass through these vallisneria beds. And so that's one more tool we can help use to clean the waters that enter the lagoon. We have 2 natural spring restoration projects that we are addressing. One we hope to kick off this summer, early spring, hopefully. And the other is taking place in the St. Johns River. Blue Springs is a well-known warm water site. That project, one of those projects has already been going on at Blue Spring, and with this money, we've been able to expand that to include further efforts at Blue Spring and foraging areas nearby. The seagrass nursery network is may sound interesting to you, but it is really important with our efforts, because to do seagrass restoration, you need donor beds typically in those areas where you can take seagrass and plant it in other areas, and those donor beds will recover. But currently in the Indian River Lagoon, we have no donor beds. Seagrasses are reduced to the point that there is no place we could take seagrass and plant it somewhere else and do it successfully. So to address that, we are helping several institutions that already have seagrass grow out facilities in the uplands to expand those facilities so we can have adequate seagrass planting material when we are prepared and we have conditions to plant them. We'll have that stock to do. And we do have 3 seagrass restoration projects that we are working on with partners that will occur within that 150-mile lagoon. We also have living shoreline projects, and you may find it surprising that we are addressing this situation also with oyster reef restoration and clam restoration. And again, there are multiple ways to address what's going on in the lagoon, and these are interesting and somewhat unique ways to do that. If you don't know, oysters and clams are both filter feeders. They filter feed large amounts of water every day, and they're removing those nutrients. And so this is another way that we can address removing nutrients from the lagoon. So as you can see, there's a wide variety of ways to address the situation. We are trying to do it in as many ways as we can and as often as we can. And so, Michelle, with that, I think we're ready to take questions and share any information that we can.
Thanks, Ron. We've had a number of questions coming in the chat throughout the conversation. I'm going to start. Lindsay asked, and this was during, Michelle, your portion of the conversation, how does the state determine a primary versus a secondary site? Is there a number of manatees that are used to make that determination?
It's a great question. No, we don't typically go off the number of manatees, as capacity could range from even between primary and secondary sites. What we're looking to identify or define is the dependency of the warm water at that site.
And another question that came up in the chat about do warm water sites like the power plant, FPNL's power plant, or the other power plants, are there any health negatives to the manatees from those sites?
Direct negatives from the water, if they're concerned about quality or impacts that way, I would say no. It's the same lagoon water that's going in is coming out. It's just warmed. It cycles through the coils within the plant, which warms up from the system happening on the inside. It's not actually being contaminated from the plant. But for impacts and concerns on the long term, yes, changes to how the plants are being run will diminish the amount of warm water in the future that is available there. And plants were put in place decades ago, and unfortunately the animals did learn to depend on them over time. It wasn't something that were established for the purpose of manatee warm water.
So there's been a lively discussion happening in the chat about the produce that's being given. So maybe Michelle or Ron, you want to speak to how the leafy greens were chosen over maybe like an invasive plant, or that's been the source of some recommendations in the chat.
Sure, I'd be happy to answer that. So in our planning process, we have looked at all forms of forage that might be available that we could use with manatees, and we haven't ruled using different types of vegetation out, but the clear winner of our conversations, I guess is the way to put it, was lettuce. We know that manatees will eat it. They use it in captivity and in rehabilitation, and manatees, once they've been exposed to it and given the time to become accustomed with it, do eat it, and it's known to be a good product to gain weight on manatees. We did look at native aquatic plants and invasive aquatic plants, but there are some issues with that. One, the logistics of harvesting it and transporting it add to the logistics we already have. The product that we will get from that, when you take it from an aquatic system and put it in the truck and pull it on top of one another and bring it over, several things occur. One is it's coming with sediments and organisms that would have to be cleaned out of that vegetation. So that's another step that we would have to take to clean all that vegetation before we could introduce it to the lagoon. The one thing, again, that we have to be cognizant of is we don't want to make the habitat worse than what it is already. That doesn't help manatees in the long run. It doesn't help the lagoon in the long run. And then that product, having been hauled from a remote location to there and having the weight of itself on top of one another, a lot of that won't be usable because it'll be crushed. And then there's the question of shelf life. Produce that's harvested and brought to us quickly, we can put in a refrigerated trailer and keep for over a week and offer it to manatees. That other vegetation that comes to us from a lake won't last that long. And so then we have disposal issues as well. So everything pointed to using fresh produce. It gave us our best option initially. That doesn't mean that we aren't looking at other sources to add to this. We are, and we're adapting as we go, but we are still sold on the produce as our best bet at this time.
Great, thank you so much, Ron. That was very well said. We had a question from Bruce that Michelle, maybe you'd be able to answer. It says, every manatee I see looks like it has a lot of stuff growing on its skin. What do we know about the cutaneous macrobiome and microbiome of manatees?
So manatees, again, being slow-moving aquatic creatures, they do invite the microbiomes to come and live on them. It's kind of a nice relationship back and forth, just like with some sea turtle species or slow-moving reef types. You do get algae growth, you get barnacle growth, and this is just a nice symbiotic relationship, and it's not harming the manatees in any ways. We do see some of them have a little bit more of an algae hairdo than others, and it really just depends on where they're spending most of their days.
Great. And Bruce asked an additional question about the manatees that make their way up to places like the Northeast Massachusetts. There's, I know there was the famous the Chesapeake manatee. Like, do they make their way back down here in the winter?
Ideally, most of them do. A lot of them know where to go for the winter time. They've got really strong site fidelity, so they should be familiar with the warm water sources. But like Chessie and some others, there have been the occasional manatee that need a little bit of assistance making their way back down for the winter.
Great. I want to just be very respectful of everyone's time, because I know especially Michelle, you and Ron are super busy, and we're about 5 minutes to 1. So I just wanted to leave some time for you and Ron and Andy, if you had any thoughts or responses to some of the questions coming up, or anything you wanted to make sure we touched on before signing off today. Andy, maybe we can start with you in case folks want to know how they can get more involved.
Yeah, so there's also a question about state funding, and just to go a little bit more into that, So as Ron mentioned, last year at the close of session, the legislature committed $8 million to habitat improvement around the state for manatees, in part to improve manatee access to some of the natural warm water springs. A good portion of that money is actually going to be used over on the West Coast, where Michelle and I are, at Warm Mineral Springs, which is one of the most important historic sites for manatees. So that will become a much more meaningful and important site to manatees after that restoration work is done. And that's going to be true elsewhere around. There was also a question about the governor's commitment. Last September, the governor committed $53 million to further water quality improvements in Indian River Lagoon. That would include replacing 3,000 septic tanks, which is, as you would imagine, a significant source with millions of people living in the watershed of nitrogen and phosphorus going into the water column. It'll also improve some of the sewage treatment plants around the lagoon, converting them over to stage 3 sewage treatment plants, which capture nutrients, which many sewage treatment plants don't do. So those are all significant steps, and more will be taken, more will be needed. But it's a very important step in the right direction. As you know, and many of you were involved with them, there are many partners throughout the state, public and private, working on manatees. And there are many ways for all of you to contribute dollars or volunteer support around the state. In terms of what we're doing and FWC is doing, you may be familiar that annually FWC issues a manatee decal and a sea turtle decal for contributions of $5 or more when you're registering your car or your vessel, that you can make a contribution. And those decals, that money adds up, and it's a way to keep manatees present in the average person's mind. Our foundation, which largely raises private funds, just completed an initial first phase of raising $240,000 to replant those 7 sites within the Indian River Lagoon tributaries that Ron mentioned. Several of those sites can be expanded, so we're continuing that fundraising effort as well. And we have pivoted, though, for the large part, to starting to raise money for this field trial of feeding emaciated manatees. So that's going to be obviously a highly adaptive effort, since it's a first-time effort. We want to make sure the FWC has as much funding available for that as possible. You can go to our website, wildlifeflorida.org, to contribute if you haven't done so. I know many of you have, and we thank you. And the other way you can support this work is we have 2 specialty license plates that pertain to manatee habitat and manatees in general. One is the Discover Florida Oceans tag. It's the one that has kind of a blue and purple tsunami looking wave on it. And the other one is the tag with the scuba diver on it, Protect Florida Springs tag. Those tags allow us to give away about $300,000 a year for springs and marine conservation, and encourage you, if you don't have a specialty license plate, to consider those too. So again, you know, it's many partners are working on this. I know Defenders of Wildlife is listening in on this call. They've been highly involved as well. Save the Manatee Club and others. So we thank everybody who is working on this issue and all of you who are supporting it.
Well said. I've dropped the link to donate in the chat for folks who are interested, in addition to a survey for our conversation today. We'd love to hear your feedback on how we could improve these in the future. Any other topics you'd love for us to cover. And if there were questions today that we didn't get a chance to cover, you could also put those in the survey, and we can send those along to Ron and Michelle to get you some answers. If you have any questions about any of this, you can, my email address is mashton@wildlifeflorida.org. Feel free to reach out to me. I just wanted to thank everyone again for their time today, and for their engagement. I think we can all agree that manatees are incredibly important to the state. I think you all taking an hour out of your day to talk with us demonstrates that. Before we let Ron and Michelle go, I didn't know if you wanted to had anything else you wanted to say, but we're incredibly grateful for your work and your time. And I know you both are super busy with everything going on.
I just want to say thank you again. Go ahead, Ron.
Same here. I just want to thank everyone for attending and listening to what we're up to, and thank the foundation for their support and everyone else that is supporting our efforts.
Yes, I echo that. We appreciate the opportunity to be here and speak with everyone. And the UME webpage that Ron had in his slides, I went ahead and put that in the chat too, for those that want to follow up and keep up with our updates.
Great, thank you all. And we hope to talk again soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.